First up, the World Bank is optimistic about Ghana's economic recovery after recent challenges. It is therefore projecting that the country's economic growth the country's economy will grow at a rate of 2.9% in 2024, slightly higher than what government has forecast in the 2024 budget. Andrew Dublin is World Bank chief economist and has been speaking to Joy Business from Washington, D.C. in the U.S.
Responses will be multiple, right? So domestically, you're talking about specifically about the shocks that come from what? Inflation, high interest rates, global.
And the bit about the fact that most of what the developing countries' recovery hinges on what happens in those developed economies. What should be the policy options for countries like Ghana in putting in place measures to minimize the expected shocks?
Yeah, so suddenly, African countries are not isolated from the rest of the world. They are, we are a globalized, world, and we trade with a lot of countries outside of our continent. In fact, a lot of our trade is with other countries outside of the continent. So shocks that happen, trade shocks, like we've seen with Ukraine, war in Ukraine, and maybe even not nearly as much at the moment, but even disruptions that are going on in the Red Sea potentially could have impact for some countries. So these shocks will happen, and downturns will happen, right? So you should be able to see, for example, if there is a slower than expected growth in major trading partners for Africa, such as the US, Europe, China, that will affect growth in Africa. So what can African countries do? Now, in principle, what you could do, of course, as African countries, is to really focus on domestic reforms.
In terms of growth rate, you projected, I think, slightly about 2% for Ghana. That's way lower than what government has targeted of about 2.8%. In terms of the growth outlook, is the World Bank a little bit measured Ghana than more of a robust outlook?
Yeah. So our most recent, I don't know what you're looking at, but our most recent estimate is that
in the Africa Pulse report, in the Africa Pulse report, growth
is going to come into about 2.8%, 2.9% this year. That's our projection in the same as 2023.
Oh, so your growth rate is 2.8%.
Yes, 2.8, 2.9 thereabouts. So that's our forecast. And so growth is not the levels that Ghana has seen in the past. We expect to see Ghana perhaps return back to about 5% growth rate around 2026. That's our focus, our projection going forward. But for 2023 and 2024, our focus is that it will grow at about 2.9%. And the reason is because of similar story that I told you about the rest of Africa, which is Ghana is dealing with high levels of debt. It's dealing with high levels of inflation. And so when you have high levels of debt, government spending and government investments are constrained. And when you have high levels of inflation, you're likely to see interest rates rise by the central bank in order to be able to bring inflation down. So that will weigh down on consumption and investments. And so, you will see these kinds of developments weigh down on economic activity in Ghana.
Some will say that is interesting, because when I go through government of Ghana budget, they are also projecting a 2.8% end of year target. It appears that you are quite robust about growth for this year, despite all these challenges from the World Bank's perspective.
Yeah, and I think there are three reasons why there is this focus, right? One is the expectation that, in fact, the fiscal consolidation is taking hold.
All right. That was the conversation with the chief economist from the World Bank. They want to bring in for a quick reaction on Zoom Dr. Patrick Asuming, who is an economist. Good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for joining us. So, feasible projection, 2.9%. What do you think?
Good afternoon and good afternoon to viewers. Yeah, I think it's feasible. I actually think that we could end up slightly higher. In recent times, I think both the bank and the fund, they've tended to be more conservative in their projections for the Ghanaian economy. So you realize that last year, the economy outperformed their projections, even including the government's projection. And I also do think that being an election year, we are likely to see a little bit more spending than planned towards the end of the year, especially if we are successful with the debt restructuring. That is going to provide the government a little bit more fiscal space. And you get the sense that especially in the area of construction on road, there will be some explosion of spending around that time. So generally, I expect that we should be able to outperform even the 2.9 that is being projected.
Seems to think that the high levels of debt as well as inflation could be a threat to our economic growth and the projections that have been made.
Yeah, I think the debt is a problem. But, in Ghana's case, it's a little bit, we've gone a little bit far in terms of our debt restructuring compared to some other African countries. Don't forget that we have a framework with our bilateral partners. We are now doing discussions with our commercial partners. But we made substantial savings from even the domestic debt exchange. That should give the government some fiscal space. And that gives it a little bit more room. What may happen, though, is that we will see a little bit more government expenditure, but we will see less efficiency in the public expenditure. Because once we get through it, once the election gets close and the election is expected to be tight again, we always get these off-budget expenditures, which usually we only get to see after the fact, after the election has happened. So, and those ones don't go through more rigorous criteria for what we commit the funds to. So that threat is there. Then the other side is, we begin to see that pressures for inflation, especially in the second quarter, might build. We've seen discussions about increases in transport fares.
Right.
And we've seen the currency begin to wobble a little bit. So all of those are threats. But you get the sense that if in the second half of the year, the advanced economies begin to ease up their financing constraint, and then also we've made progress with our own domestic debt restructuring, you will see more fiscal space, and then the government in an election year with fiscal space will definitely spend.
Yeah, and I know we've talked about it over and over again about this being an election year and that the government has to check spending and all of that. The World Bank seems to think that policy slippages during this election year could be a major threat.
I'm actually expecting that the threat will actually materialize. I think, so we've gone through this for a long time. Even though we get promises upon promises that we will overspend, I think the incentive to overspend is extremely strong. And I don't think the controls to prevent that overspending is enough. We are hoping that we might be able to get the fiscal council in place and all, but we know how things work in this country. We might put the laws in place and we find ways around it. So I am actually expecting that the policy slippages will actually happen. It's just a matter of extent, and then you just hope that the extra budgetary spending is committed to things that will have a long-term value, especially if that went to fixing our energy problems, we won't complain too much, or if that went to fixing some of our infrastructure, which is beginning to deteriorate, that won't hurt too much. But if a lot of it goes to spending, then the real troubles will begin after the election year.
So what policy reforms do we need to put in place to aid our recovery and sustain the growth that we are witnessing? Plus, I was just taking a look at the GDP estimates for last year, and industry still continues to struggle.
I think right now, given that we are in an IMF program, I think reforms aimed at strengthening governance is crucial. I think right now the biggest threat is following through the budget, the execution as we have it. So, and then also reforms to curb corruption, because those are major problems that we've had. So I think the issue about whether government will stay true to its plan, I've already said that that's unlikely to happen. But these are times for us to lay foundation. So I think the governance side, the financial governance side, the economic governance side, the political governance side, that those reforms are crucial. Then when we move outside of that, at the same time, we still need to make investment for our long-term future. And I think whatever we can do to fix the energy problems, we see all the energy difficulties for the energy sector. The government has been reluctant to admit them. But the thing with, especially the electricity side, is that if our lights are not on, they are not on. There's nothing we can do, no propaganda will change that fact. I think it will be good that the government admits and we begin to find long-term solutions to the energy challenges, so that while we are going through the IMF program, strengthening the macroeconomic environment, we are also building for the future. We are laying a stronger foundation for the future, because if the energy problems we had last year, energy production, electricity production alone was 10% lower than the year before. So regardless of what the political leaders will tell us, we are not having any dooms or whatever they think, the fact is clear. So I think we need to pay attention to fixing the energy sector. And if we do, we will lay ourselves a stronger foundation going forward.
Dr. Patrick Asuming, thank you so much for your time and the insights appreciated. You're watching The Marketplace now.